Yeah. Okay, so now it's 3 o'clock in Norway, 9 o'clock in US. And on behalf of Ray Bradley, who is traveling in Scotland, I would like to welcome you all to this 8th season of the International Quaternary Webinar. We have a very exciting program this fall. We have a little problem with the Zoom link today, but it's probably going to be working better next week. Then you can go into the new web page. Is it you, Megan, who made it? Or Ray? I don't know. It's a new website, but anyway.
Our communications person.
Okay, yeah, very nice web page. And there is a link that you can use to access. Hopefully next week it will work. So, and here in Bergen, we actually have a class here that's taking a course at the university. It's a course called Polar Paleoclimate, led by Andreas Bohm here. And they will be given the opportunity to ask questions first. And then after that, we will invite all of you to ask questions. So today, I'm very happy to introduce Willem van der Bilt, who is on travel to Germany today. But he is a researcher here in our department in Bergen. And he is going to give an exciting talk about last glacial maximum sediments from ice-free Arctic oasis, revealed in warm Heinrich stadial summers. So with that, Willem, the word is yours.
Thank you, Jostein, for the introduction. And sorry, I left all the names of myself, but also my collaborators on this exciting data that I will present to you today. I particularly want to thank Jostein, who was really important helper to extract these sediments and working on them during my PhD, but also Willem Andrea, who worked with me on the biomarker data that I will present, and Christine Lane, Cambridge University, who was really important in establishing a chronology that allowed us to understand how old this stuff was. So as the title, rather long title suggests, I'm going to talk about some lake sediments from a high Arctic lake that capture Heinrich stadial 2. I will say a little bit more about Heinrich stadials and what they are, also for the students in the room, but I will, it's a bit like preaching to the choir, but they're cold glacial spells that have been associated in ice rafting, particularly in the North Atlantic Ocean, but their causes remain contested. So this story really is a bit of a journey of discovery that started many years ago during my PhD and is still in progress. And now I will build it up as such, going a little bit back in time to establish where we are and why we find these sediments, then end up with the biomarker data that we only recently extracted from these sediments to use them to our advantage to tell a little bit more about what Heinrich stadial conditions might have been on Svalbard. So yes, a little bit about the little lake site that I've been working on and present today. It's focused on a small lake called Heinrich, which is not, for those of you who are familiar with Svalbard, not too far away from Ny-Ålesund. And as you can see here in the middle, even today you see some glaciers in the background. And they're less than a few kilometers away, and let alone during the time span that is covered by the record that I'm presenting, where conditions were at least 10 degrees colder on average and possibly much more, the last glacial maximum. As you can see there on the far right-hand side, but also the little white line in the inset on the lower left. This place, most reconstructions suggest that this place was covered by ice, and not just a little bit by kilometers of ice during the last glacial maximum. So it was a surprise, to put it mildly, that we found evidence of a lacustrine environment during this time period. And I don't think anyone would have bet money at the time that we would find this lake sediment sequence. What's also very important for the story is that this lake sits just above the marine limit. So we didn't have to worry about the influence of any marine organic carbon or other material. So yes, this story started a long time ago in 2015. At the time I was publishing the work of my PhD. And here I highlight a sentence from my first paper that states that samples were not calibrated due to an improbable age. So the first paper where I presented the sediment data from this lake Heinrich, I just left this out completely. At the time I dated some mosses. You see a picture of these mosses there in the green little square in the rectangle that were 30,000 years old. And I just discarded them because I thought they can't be 30,000 years old. That's crazy. The rest of the sediments were Holocene. That was also the focus of my PhD, Holocene glacier variability. So I just discarded them because they were improbably old. Well, a couple of years later, and hopefully a little bit wiser, I decided to revisit these improbable radiocarbon ages, because at the time, more and more records showed that, you know, even in the high Arctic and high Antarctic, there were some surprising finds of sections and lake sediment sequences of stuff that was, you know, deposited during time spans where the place should have been covered by ice based on our best knowledge. The first thing we did was to perform XRD analysis, X-ray diffraction, to assess that there were no carbonates in these sediments, so that we could exclude the possibility that they were dealing with reservoir effects that would yield radiocarbon dates that are much older than the material that we date. So as you can see there in these diffractograms on the right-hand side, it was fairly run-of-the-mill stuff, a lot of quartz, a lot of phyllosilicates, absolutely no evidence of coal or carbonates that you might find in Svalbard. So started to become a little bit more confident that maybe these days, the 3 dates, by the way, between 30 and 20,000 years, were not so improbable. But what was really important for this study, and also the work that builds on it that I'm presenting today, was the tephra work that I carried out together with Christine Lane at Cambridge University. So we managed to extract 8, 9 little pieces of glass, that extract them from the sediments and get microprobe data from these to find out what they are, where they came from. And to our great surprise and delight, the first thing we realized is that their geochemistry was homogeneous. Now, typically, if you have volcanic ash particles, if they are not homogeneous, that indicates reworking, for example, by snow or ice. So I'm very happy that we're homogeneous. And to our second surprise, we found that we could actually tie them to their source region, which, as it happened to be, were the Azores Islands, which are many, many thousands of kilometers to the south in the central Atlantic. And we're quite lucky because at the time, just a few years earlier, a Swedish research group led by Stefan Westergaard had done some work on volcanic sections on the Azores Islands to better understand the geochemical composition of the tephras that were found in other parts of the world. And we could use that work to our advantage to use the major oxide data plotted in these biplots to identify a specific source volcano that we could tie these deposits to, which is the Pico Alto volcano on one of the islands of the Azores. So it kept on getting better and better. Now also, at the time, these islands were quite volcanically active, and at the time on this particular volcanic system, there was a large ignimbrite forming eruption that left a lot of deposits. And as they were building roads to these islands, people have been digging out sections and also collecting material at the very base of the lava flows. Now here, what I show in the lower right-hand side is the radiocarbon depth from our lake, Lake Heinrich, in the light green, overlapping with the cumulative age distribution of roots, wood found at the base of an ignimbrite forming eruption from this particular volcanic system on the Azores at the time. Well, of course, there are uncertainties, but they overlap quite nicely. So based on that chronological overlap and the geochemical composition, we concluded that this stuff really was as old as we thought it was. It really is a sediment sequence that was deposited between 20 and 30,000 years ago. And to celebrate this, and also the fact that we managed to get it into Science Advances at the time, which is already a few years ago, I managed to go over to this island, Terceira Island in the Azores. It sits there in a rift zone. And it might be called Pico Alto, this volcano, but when I was there, it was not alto at all. It was a little bit of an underwhelming hill. So it was a bit of an anticlimax, but it was really cool that we, to see this volcano also tie this eruption on Svalbard, these little glass shards on Svalbard, to an eruption that happened so far away. Then back to the sediments. So after dating, and we started to think a little bit like, how could we end up with lake sediments at this place during such a cold period? And one of the things that were really important in figuring out what might have happened here was the fact that these sediments were very, very, very dense. You could hit them with a hammer and nothing would happen. And I'm trying to show this on the right-hand side here. So the bit that dates between 20 and 30,000 years ago is very, very dense. Then It's followed by 10,000 years of non-deposition before the Holocene sediments start at the very top. As you can see, they are very, very light in comparison to the stuff at the base. Now, this is quite diagnostic for a very particular type of setting. That's described very nicely by Jason Briner and others in this paper from 2007. Here, I tried to visualize it on the right-hand side. So we think happened is that this lake environment, when it stopped receive sediment, it was overrun by cold-based non-erosive ice. So ice that did not scoop out sediments, probably slowly advanced over a thick permanent lake ice cover. And as it applied weight on the underlying sediments, it compressed those sediments and at the same time also caused that period of 10,000 year period of non-deposition between 20,000 years ago and the onset of the Holocene. So what we think happened here is that after the lake stopped receiving sediments around 20,000 years ago, it was overrun by cold-based ice. And when that disappeared, during the start of the Holocene, sedimentation resumed. I'd also like to stress that while this is a bit special, there's been evidence from Svalbard for many decades that suggests that there were ice-free pockets on the archipelago, sometimes even going further back in time. For example, these beach ridges that are OSL dated to around 40,000 years ago, that suggests that there were large areas ice-free at the time. Also, the seismic data, sedimentological data from glaciogenic debris flows at the edge of the shelf that suggests that only 21,000 years ago, depending on what calibration you use, ice advanced to the shelf. So again, relatively late advanced during the last glacial maximum. And last but not least, the amazing evidence in the last 2 decades from exposure dating, cosmogenic exposure dating, that suggests that on Svalbard, the uplands have been ice-free for a very, very long period of time, up to 80 to 100,000 years ago, whereas the lowlands have been covered by erosive ice in many places. So our narrative and these data fit into a much wider and long-standing discussion about the extent and timing of ice and ice-free conditions on Svalbard. And at the time when this was published in Science Advances, we didn't really pursue an in-depth discussion of the paleoclimatology. But what we did put forward at the time was the notion that maybe this site was ice-free up until 20,000 years ago, until the moment where the formation of open polynyas off the coast, especially towards the northeast, which is sitting in the direct angle of the dominant wind systems, which are the northeasterly winds. At the time when these polynyas opened up, moisture was transported from these bits of open ocean and dumping snow onto our study site. And here I try to visualize that by showing the ice extent from 2 places, one in the northeast of Svalbard and the other in the southwest. And around 20,000 years ago, there's evidence that there's a rapid decrease in sea ice extent and coverage in the northeast, so allowing that moisture to be picked up. Well, that was just a stab in the dark that was based on a bunch of sea ice records. We didn't really pursue it further. Also, helping out with is the fact that it was established that this particular area, so our study site, Lake Heinrich, was sheltered quite a bit from the main ice streams on the archipelago. So also making it more plausible that maybe there were pockets of non-erosive ice sitting in between the ice streams that were draining into the fjords. But I am, or at least I call myself, a paleoclimatologist. So I was always interested in pursuing this a little bit further. I was always interested in figuring out what these sediments could tell us in terms of what lived in this place. It was a lake, maybe there was something living there, maybe there's evidence of plants, maybe there were biomarkers that we could use to say something about hydrological changes or temperatures. So already 4 or 5 years ago, we analyzed a bunch of test samples, and you see the first results there on the right-hand side. And these suggest that there were lipid biomarker compounds present in these sediments, even though it took us another couple of years to figure out how to measure them in a reliable way. But we did pursue this, and the reason why we pursued this is shown there in the central bit of this slide, it's a CT image of this particular part of that sediment core from Lake Huron, and it shows these millimeter to centimeter scale microlaminations, suggesting that it was a low energy environment, layer by layer, so making it quite suitable for a paleoclimate reconstruction. So that's what we did, squeezing every drop of a lipid biomarker out of these sediment samples. And as we did so, as I'll show in the next couple of slides, also turning the interpretation of some of these proxies that we had applied on Holocene sediments on the archipelago upside down, because the very particular specifics of this site allowed us to, think through the interpretation of some of these proxies. So now I will take you through the three main lines of evidence that we used in this study to build up this narrative, just quickly discussing the type of proxies that we used and how we did use them. So the first proxy that we used for this story is alkinone saturation, which is based on these fats produced by haptophyte algae you find in the ocean and lakes. And here, this picture on the left-hand side is the most famous family member. And they break or build these double bonds to basically retain a constant level of viscosity as their environmental temperature changes. So the number of these double bonds is indicative for the temperatures. It's a direct biochemical response to changing temperature regime. And I try to show this there on the right-hand side. This is, if you measure these on a gas chromatographer, this is how these data come out. And then in blue, there's a sample from Svalbard. And in red, there's a sample from northern Norway. You see that there are changes in the distribution of these double bonds. This you can use to calculate paleo temperatures. Now, this work had already been carried out on Holocene samples from Lake Huron, but also a bunch of other lakes on Svalbard as part of my PhD and postdoc. And what I'm trying to show you on this slide here, using a chemotaxonomic indicator, RAK 3738, that the distribution of these chemotaxonomic indicators highlights that the type of algae that produce the alkinones on Svalbard derives from one particular group, one particular genetic group, which is called group 1. And the good thing about that is that this group tends to dominate in freshwater environments in the Northern Hemisphere. And that a lot of research has been done also on Svalbard, and that we know a lot about the temperature sensitivity of the abundance of these double bonds I was just talking about. So here you see in gray how the distributions of all samples measured on Svalbard and Svalbard lakes fit within the 95% distribution of these group 1 haptophytes that have been found in lakes across the Northern Hemisphere. And on top of that, in green-blue, you see how these glacial samples match that. So long story short, the samples that we measured from this LGM lake sediment sequence in Lake Huron, they belong to the exact same group of algae that also produced alkinones during the Holocene. So we thought we could build on the temperature relations that we established for the Holocene. So now we end the first instance where proxy interpretations had to be turned upside down, because based on the temperature relation that exists for this group, we found that our glacial samples show the temperature range that was significantly broader than what we found in samples from the Holocene, but also that even the coldest extremes, but particularly the warmest, suggest higher temperatures during the last glacial maximum in this lake. And of course, that is very implausible if you assume that, as during the Holocene, water temperatures are in equilibrium, shall we say, with atmospheric temperatures. So after thinking this over and over and over, we realized that there were some modern analogs that could help us explain what we might be dealing with, and showing one of them on the right-hand side there, the McMurdo Dry Valleys on Antarctica, which is a little oasis. Well, it's not really pleasant, but it's an oasis because it's ice-free. It's very cold and dry. So the ice is not, there's a couple of lakes there that are permanently ice covered. And the central part of this slide, I show a temperature profile from one of these lakes. It is covered by a permanent lake ice cover. And it suggests that temperatures just below that permanent lake ice cover are very high. Now you might look at this and think, well, 6 degrees, very high. No, it's not super warm. Bear in mind that this place has an annual average temperature of minus 17 degrees Celsius. It's more than 20 degrees warmer than the overlying atmosphere. So in other words, we think that these suspiciously high temperatures that we get from the alkenones in Lake Huron might be explained by the fact that this lake at the time, the last glacial maximum, at least 10 degrees colder, was covered permanently by lake ice, and that this lake ice cover acted as some sort of a greenhouse, effectively allowing the heat in and trapping it in the lake, as we also observe and measure in modern settings. And adding a little bit to that, using another monitoring study from similarly permanently ice-covered lake, but this time from the high Canadian Arctic, I want to show that these temperatures are particularly high when a so-called moat forms around the lake. Now, moat is that little bit of liquid water that you see particularly well in panel number F there in the lower right-hand side. So when this moat, this little line of liquid water exists for a few weeks, and it's small enough, it's big enough to allow warming of shallow surface waters, but it's at the same time not big enough to allow the ice to start move around and break up, then you see the highest temperatures in these type of lakes. And we'll get back to that later when I interpret the data in a bit more detail. Also typical for those type of sites, so lakes that are permanently covered by ice, with the exception of a few weeks in summer season when this moat, when this little ring of liquid water forms, is progressive evaporative enrichment due to the melt and reformation of ice, but also evaporation from this, exposed bit of water. These lakes grow more saline over time and become heavily stratified. And I try to highlight this by showing the conductivity profile from the same lake that I showed the temperature profile from. Underneath a permanent ice cover, you see very high conductivity. In fact, these lakes can be more saline than the sea itself. So taking this back to our side, we found that there is indeed a very strong relationship between the temperatures that we get, the alkanone-derived temperatures on the x-axis, shown there with the UK 37 index, and the amount of bromide, which is a halide ion that is quite typical of salt, sea salt, one of the halide ions that is best measured on the XRF. So another line of evidence suggests to tell us a little bit more about what this site might have been at the time. Then the last line of evidence that we relied on was leaf waxes, their chain length distribution, and we were looking to measure isotopes on them. Typically, this provides information about type of vegetation that grows in catchment, but also the hydrological cycle and hydroclimate change. So typically, traditionally, the shorter molecules, so the mid-chain alkanes, they're shown on the left-hand side there between molecules between 21 and 25 carbon atoms. They are typically associated with aquatic vegetation, whereas the long chain alkanes shown here on the right-hand side are typically associated with terrestrial vegetation. Now, this very generic subdivision has been scrutinized in the last couple of years, especially for the Arctic. But typically when people start looking at this, you start distinguishing these mid and long chains. So looking at this and then looking at the samples that we analyzed from these glacial sediments in green again, based on that generalization, one could argue that the samples from the LGM were richer in land plants than those samples that were analyzed from the Holocene that I show there in gray. And again, this is another moment where we had to really rethink how we would interpret those proxies turn them upside down, because again, it was 10 degrees colder. There's no way that this was a nice lush oasis that was richer in land plants than the Holocene environment. So again, there were monitoring studies that came to the rescue. In this particular instance, chain length distribution of drought-tolerant mosses that have been collected by Cybulski and others for their wonderful paper in 2017, collecting information on the ecological gradients and preferences of Arctic mosses. And this study and a number of others highlights that these long chain lengths that we typically associate with terrestrial plants, that they also dominate in mosses, particularly in the species of mosses that are very drought resistant. So in other words, the long chain abundances in an environment like this might be used as a measure of the aridity. So greater abundance of long chain molecules might reflect greater aridity. So putting this all together, these lines of evidence, so in the middle there, the alkanone-derived temperatures, at the top in green, the abundance of long leaf wax chain lengths, and at the base, the enrichment in bromide or halide ions. We can see a pattern that is mimicked between these three independently measured proxies. And they suggest that when things got warm, around 25,000 years ago, moisture availability increased and the lake increasingly stratified. So we see a relationship between warming, increase in salt ion concentrations, and then changes in leaf wax distributions that also suggest greater water availability along that moat, along the shores. And also, if you look at the base, this peak warming coincide with Heinrich stadial 2. And I didn't say much about in the beginning of this talk, but these Heinrich stadials are typically associated with cold conditions. While they were initially attributed to ice sheet instability, subsequent iceberg rafting and the formation of ice rafted debris horizons known as Heinrich events. It can be found throughout the North Atlantic. In recent years, there have been plenty of discussions where people have been rethinking the fundamental driving mechanisms of these Heinrich events based on their timing and the spatial distribution of what we find in the proxy records. And more and more evidence suggests that they were not driven by internal ice sheet stability, but there might have been an external climatic trigger. And we hope that our data contributes a little piece to that puzzle that's been quite actively revisited in the last couple of years. Before we dive into that, I would also like to stress that while none of these studies had this particular period and this particular trend as their main angle, there's been loads and loads of work in the last couple of decades that have suggested that conditions around Svalbard might actually have been relatively mild, at least during the summertime. That's also really important, by the way. All these proxies here that we measure, they capture a period of maybe a couple of weeks at most in summer, where the lake was, where liquid water was available, where biological molecules could be synthesized. So we're looking at summer season here. That's very important. But there have been numerous other studies over the last couple of decades to suggest that Svalbard was relatively mild. I should maybe not use the word mild, but not nearly as horrible as one would expect, let's put it like that, during this Heinrich stadial 2. For example, the work by Juliane Müller, which I will show later on as well, suggests that there were seasonally open conditions in the Fram Strait during Heinrich stadial 2, but also the work done here in Bergen by Tom Docke and others that suggests that there were these very productive phases that coincide with Heinrich stadial 2 up to 4. So we're not the first. We are the first, though, to find a terrestrial sequence that captures a surface warming trend. Then, in addition to the evidence found on Svalbard, the notion that these stadials, these Heinrich stadials, are not just cold across the board, but that maybe they were rather defined by extreme seasonality, and warm or at least mild summers has also been gaining traction in the last couple of years. So again, we're not the first to hint, to point our finger in that direction. Here show a number of studies, really interesting recent paper by George Denton and others, called Heinrich summers, that also goes into this idea that maybe Heinrich events were not just cold, but summers were relatively mild, and some of the proxy signals that we're looking at obscures that signal because they integrate conditions from year round. But also a couple of modeling studies that there is some noise in the background. Could everyone mute, please? Or someone else? Anyway, loads of studies in recent years that suggest that these Heinrich stadials might not just be cold, but rather marked by extreme seasonality. So we find, comparing our data, and here I'll just stick for the sake of convenience, because as I showed you before, we have these 3 different independently measured indicators that all point in the same direction. So here I'm just going to stick to what I think is our most robust proxy, which is the alkinone-derived surface temperatures, plot them together with a bunch of other records. So here we show that warming here on Svalbard during Heinrich Stadial 2 definitely leads ice rafting. So in other words, our study adds to mounting evidence that maybe ice rafting, maybe that collapse of ice sheets, not the ultimate trigger of Heinrich events. Maybe we need to look at another trigger, and maybe that trigger was climatic. Also, as I mentioned before, we looked at data from a lake, so we're capturing a signal that's related to surface climate change. There's a bunch of other records in the region that show a similar trend during the summers of Heinrich Stadial 2. As I mentioned before, the work by Juliane Müller, here shown at the top, that suggests a more seasonally open sea ice conditions during Heinrich Stadial 2. Also at the base, a very interesting record from the Gulf of Alaska by Walchuk and others, 2020 in Science, that suggests the Cordilleran ice sheet was melting around the time. And this is particularly important in terms of better understanding the climate signal, because this ice sheet is not sitting in the North Atlantic, but drains into the Pacific. And that makes it that it kind of, like our data, it doesn't really, it makes it less plausible, or at least we argue that because of that, it's not very likely that the ocean was the dominant forcing mechanism involved here. As I mentioned before, we see surface melt when ice sheet ends up in the Pacific Ocean, the Cordilleran ice sheet, not in the North Atlantic. Here on the right-hand side, I show a transect from a coupled climate model simulation that shows the surface response during Heinrich Stadial 2 as simulated in comparison with the last glacial maximum. And it suggests that if the cause will be oceanic, so if the ultimate cause will be a change in ocean circulation, then one would expect a lowering of surface temperatures. So in other words, the ample evidence that we see in our study area, near our study area, but also further afield of surface warming is not consistent with the signature, what you would expect to see if a change in ocean circulation was involved in triggering of this event. So because of this, we think that the ultimate causes might be found in the atmosphere rather than the ocean. And in that sense, it's worth pointing out that, a warming of summer seasons in the high Arctic could be explained by a shift in the intertropical conversion zone.
Hello. Hello. It's like a party, a packing party.
Hey, who is talking? It's super loud on my headphone, but okay. Anyways, where was I? Yes. So thinking about what might have driven this response and trying to tie it in with what we know of the atmosphere, we think that maybe warming in summer in Svalbard, but also the other records that we show here, might be explained by shift in the intertropical conversion zone, either by warming in the south or cooling in the north. What would happen in such a case is that we'd see a change in the amount of heat transported from one hemisphere to the other. In this particular case, from the relatively warm southern hemisphere into the northern hemisphere, and that being a source of heat at a time where things are very cold, where there was also absolutely no radiated forcing. Insulation was low and stable. And while this is just an idea, it is tied in to a number of recent studies. And I think what's also interesting to highlight here is that when you look for proxy evidence of intertropical convergence zone shifts in our broader study area, there is evidence from the Sahel, and I try to show this here in the lower left-hand side, which sits at the modern northernmost margin in intertropical convergence zone, where at that time there is evidence of increased aridity as more Saharan dust is blown onto the coring location of the record that it's shown there by Mulitsa and others. So it's certainly not definitive evidence, but this is just one of the ideas we've thrown up, that it could have been changes in the position of the intertropical convergence zone to help explain why we see this surface warming response in Svalbard, but also in other areas in our study area. And with that, I would like to leave you. So thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Willem, holding your time. So now it's time for question, and I think we'll start with Bergen here. And since we only have this microphone here, you have to come forward to ask the question. So yeah, Willem.
Hi, Willem.
Hey, Arne.
You talked about this permanent lake ice and how it sort of creates this signal of higher temperatures and also higher salinity. So it's obviously not in equilibrium with the atmosphere or anything else. So can sort of that then be compared with, you know, other trends? Can it say something about regional temperature at the time, or because obviously the conditions in the lake don't really represent the atmospheric conditions at the time?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and it's also something that we pondered on for quite some time. And I would say that even though there is not the link between atmospheric temperatures and lake temperatures here, in this setting is affected by various feedback. So I don't think you can apply these alkaline temperature calibrations that we can use for this kind of proxy in Holocene. So I didn't, but still the direction of the trend is indicative, right? So if temperatures get warmer in the lake, then that means, in my opinion, that the atmosphere warms. At the same time, taking it to this slide, it shows the temperature profile in a similar, or what I think was a similar site in the high Canadian Arctic. It's also worth stressing that when warming proceeds beyond the tipping point, and that tipping point being the complete removal of lake ice coverage, then this relationship breaks down, right? So if you no longer have a permanent lake ice cover or a moat, small moat surrounding that lake and its ice cover, then all of a sudden the whole water column is exposed to the atmosphere, and then surface temperatures cool down significantly. So it's just a very, very narrow range of conditions, really. But again, we're talking about a time where surface conditions were at least 10 degrees colder than today. So I think it's incredibly unlikely that this lake would have lost its permanent lake ice cover at the time.
One more question, Willem. You sort of compared this, or first of all, you said that you thought it was quite a sort of strong seasonal gradient during this event, and you also compared it to the Younger Dryas. Do you think what you're looking at here could be the case for other Heinrich events?
I think it could, but I'm reluctant to make any bold statements about it because it requires data. But, taking it back to what we do know, it is interesting to see that, you know, this ties into a broader body of work, also using different lines of evidence. I didn't really spend much time on that in this slide, but, you know, there's a modeling study at the base. There's a study in the middle that's based on dated moraines, and then using ELA models to reconcile the extent of the paleoglacier with, you know, the required temperature conditions, realizing that in order to, you know, make these lines of evidence meet, one would require warmer summers. And in the top, more of like a review paper. So there are a number of authors that are working on this at the moment, and also for other stadials, other Heinrich stadials, but also other stadials, including the younger dryas. So yeah, might be the case that this mechanism, most of all the notion of extreme seasonality during these stadials, is something that is typical for at least the last couple of stadials during the last glacial. Yeah.
All right, thank you, Willem.
Thank you, Jale. Is there more questions from the students? No? Can we? Yeah, okay, Jan, Jon-Inge, come forward. You're Jon-Inge Svensson from University of Bergen.
Hi, Willem.
Hey, Jon-Inge.
I have one question about the sediments. You said with the fossils in it, what kind of fossils did you find in the sediments? I'm thinking about algae, plant remains. You had moss stems that was radiocarbon dated. And was it also the fact that I got the understanding that it was stratified, kind of laminations in the sediments?
Yes, all of that's true. The sediments were microlaminated, and yeah, we did initially find mosses that we sent out for dating. Those mosses were brown mosses. They could not be identified to species level because they were so, you know, old, well preserved, and not perfectly preserved. Based on the lipid biomarker work, we know that there were algae living in the water column. We also know that there were mosses and maybe even vascular plants producing these leaf waxes that were living along the shore. And then something that I should also point out, that's like work in progress, that Inge Alsos and Drusa and her group have been performing DNA analyses on these sediments, and they reveal even more. So the ultimate answer, what lives here, what lived there, and what kind of ecosystem this was, is something that will hopefully be revealed in the years to come.
So did you look for microfossils in it? I mean, algae.
Yeah, and the only thing that I found, and just barely enough for dating, was just the remains of aquatic mosses. That was it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, more question from Bergen. Then I think we go over to you, Master Morel. Do you have any questions from there?
No, I think we don't have any questions from you, Mads.
No question for you, Matt. Okay, so then the floor is open for everyone. Is there any questions from anyone? Willem. Please just unmute and take the word. See who you are, so.
Hi, I have a question from the University of Buffalo Elizabeth Thomas Group. Since you had mentioned that drought-tolerant mosses could be a source of the longer chain alkanes. I forget if you mentioned this too, but are the species or genera of moss from that Zaboski paper you mentioned also found on Svalbard today, or would this be kind of a types of mosses that would have been a part of like a vegetation change during this period 20,000-30,000 years ago?
Thanks. That's a very nice question. Yes. So this particular moss, the three mosses that they analyzed, they are found in similar settings today on Svalbard, so ice proximal environments, and also in our study area. So the main moss that they relied on was T-nitens that dominates many upland areas near the ice in Svalbard even today. So they are species that are found today on Svalbard, but are also known to Svalbard from the paleo records.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Great talk, by the way.
Thanks.
Hey, Willem. Thanks for the nice talk. This is Elizabeth.
Hey,
Uh,
hello.
If I may also ask a question, I am curious, that's a cool mechanism that you propose about the atmosphere being the source of heat to this region. That's something we've thought about before as well. I'm curious about the ITCZ record. It looks like that suggests that the ITCZ is actually pushed southward, and so the heat and moisture transport would actually be sort of less towards the north. Is that the case, or did I understand that wrong?
Well, there's two things here. So yes, you are correct that the record suggests, I'm trying to get back to it, but my slides are hanging. That you are correct that it suggests that there's increased aridity and that the ITCZ moves south. But that means that it moves into the relatively warmer southern hemisphere to allow additional heat being transitioned across the equator into the northern hemisphere, at least during summertime. I skipped over a number of steps there because otherwise it would be too long, and I think I might have skipped over too many steps. I'm sorry for that.
Okay, thanks.
Yes, the floor is still open. We miss you in Bergen, Elizabeth.
We miss Bergen, but Christian is here for a couple months. He just arrived, so that's awesome. We're really glad to have him.
Yeah, good. Okay, is anyone else having any questions? Yeah, good.
Yes, if I may. Willem, thanks so much for a really interesting talk. I would like to zoom back to the more local scale. So you suggested, or the data suggests that there is a permanent ice cover, right? And so I wondered, would you see any other evidence in your sediments that points towards anoxic conditions? So I would expect to see anoxic conditions at some point. I mean, there may be vars. That's probably one, but did you also see like, I don't know, manganese, iron ratios, etc.?
Well, that's also a very interesting question. And the thing here is that conditions at the time productivity was definitely very, very low, right? And these sediments are super minerogenic. I did not really dwell so much on that, but they are very, very minerogenic. Like organic carbon content was so low you can barely call it measurable. So if there was any form of redox response, which I agree with you, one would expect, it's not something that we could easily tease out of the sediments because they're so minerogenic. So I hope that kind of answers your question. So unfortunately, we've not been able. Maybe measuring additional compounds. I don't know.
So Toby, when you are on the microphone, you can do a little teaser for next week. You're going to be the speaker for next week.
Yeah, cool. Thanks so much. Takes me on a wrong leg, but no. So yeah, we will actually present our work, or I will present our most recent work that's been published about anoxia in lake sediments from Greenland, down in Greenland. That's a project with Ray and Isla at UMass, doing my postdoc. And yes, now I'm just compiling the presentation. And so I'm looking forward to next week. I'm really excited to have the opportunity to show our newest findings. Thanks so much already for organizing this super nice webinar series.
We're looking forward to next week, Toby. Okay, more questions from anyone? No, okay. Thank you so much, Willem. It was a very nice talk, and hopefully the Zoom link will work for next week. So see you all then.